You ever wonder why living in modern times is incomparable to the past? Well, let's take the Shakespearean era, for example, and compare it to now. Well, first of all, with a life expectancy of 40 years, you'd really suspect something's wrong, right? Firstly, living back then with a major health risk is not considered something you'd want to do. Just imagine living in extremely unsanitary conditions all around you, from your house to public areas, not to mention the fact that they would shower once every blue moon. I mean, seriously, just take a look at this guy right here. Second of all, the chances of you surviving during the plague, let's just say, are really low, with diseases spreading faster by the day. Just think of how all these advancements in our health practices are compared to what the people of the Elizabethan era had to go through. Not only that, but people would often have to live in extremely polluted environments because of the poor sewage systems they had back then, and most people would often throw their waste on streets with barely any cleaning. Dental practices were also extremely unpleasant, without any anesthetics, and the majority of people would end up losing their teeth to awful oral hygiene. Well, if you're ever wondering what people did back in the day without internet or connection across the world, then know that it wasn't even that bad. If you were living during that time, the theater was probably your go to entertainment because it was often very cheap and generally most people could afford to go to them. Majority of people also enjoyed playing sports that are pretty common now, such as ancient soccer, wrestling, ancient tennis, and archery. People also really enjoyed and were enthusiastic and passionate about their board games. Let's just say it got pretty physical over a game of backgammon or chess. Some other methods of entertainment involved something known as bear baiting, which is extremely common back then, where a bear would be tied by a chain and held by posts to be attacked by rounds and dogs over and over till the bear was killed. However, unfortunately, this practice is still continued in some areas illegally.
Today, many of us care about what we put into our mouths. After all, we know the consequences in not eating healthy. However, back then, in the Shakespearean era, it was different. First of all, water was disgusting. It was not the fresh, clean water we all love, but rather a liquid that causes life-threatening diseases. To compensate for the lack of water, people drank alcohol instead. Drinks such as ale and wine if you're rich. Unlike now, in the Shakespearean era, there was no minimum drinking age, so children could drink all the alcohol they wanted. For food, vegetables were rarely eaten, but fruits were popular and often used to add that extra sweetness to a dish. The main meal people loved and ate was meat. While it sometimes was a bit expensive for the lower classes, everyone still loved meat. The lower classes would often eat white meat as it was cheaper, and wealthier classes would eat red meat. Another food people liked, especially the lower class, was bread. Aside from bread, meat, and fruits, there were not many other foods that were consumed, which meant that it was a very small variety of food the population could choose from. Many people are often really picky about where they're living in. If you go to a cheaper hotel, you'll probably hear a kid yelling, "Mom, this place sucks. Can we go home?" Well, those cheaper hotels would probably be the same, if not better, than the average house in Shakespearean's England. The houses during these times were weak and unsturdy. The roofs were thatched and often acted as nests for dirty insects. Imagine trying to cook a delicious and creamy soup, but when you turn your back for 1 second, a beetle drops from the roof into the pot and ruins your meal. The beds were also filthy. Made of straw, it was often filled with lice and fleas, which meant that most people you met at the time most likely had lice. The city was extremely crowded. This is because the city was small and very populated. A fun fact was people didn't have technology and electricity back then. So instead of all the people you see walking around with their heads down, looking at their phones, they would be looking up at others. Without electricity, one could imagine how the atmosphere would be so much different from all of the many torches put up everywhere. Back then, there was also a very clear distinction between social classes. First of all, the lower class citizens were the majority of the population. Over 1/3 of the citizens were in poverty, while the rest sat in between poverty and the middle class. These lower class citizens would often be hard labor workers whose working hours would start from 5 a.m. all the way to 8 p.m., as if waking up before noon was hard enough. The middle class would be filled up with occupations such as tradesmen, merchants, carpenters, and overall jobs that would take more skill. While it was better than being a low-class citizen, it was nothing compared to the wealthy. The middle class could not even freely choose their own clothes to wear. They were forced to select from the clothes that followed sumptuary laws that stated what you can and cannot wear. These laws were made to allow more distinction between the classes. The upper classes wore the most luxurious clothes made with expensive materials. After all, since they were born into wealth, they could afford most things in life. With the expensive materials at the wealthy's disposal, they all chose to wear big clothes, often with a lot of jewelry. Getting married was very common in this time. In fact, it was looked down upon if you were single. Marriage was also typically arranged by families, especially if you were in a wealthy family. At the time, marrying for love was uncommon, which is hard to believe because spending the rest of your life with someone you don't like sounds rather unpleasant. Women were much lower to men at the time. They could not get jobs, and they would have to spend all their time as a housewife, looking after kids or making meals for the family. The only education they would receive would be how to become a better housewife. As for education in general, the times were getting smarter and smarter. However, people were still illiterate, so those who could read would often storytell. Lastly, there were many small crimes committed in the city, such as pickpocketing and begging. There were small punishments for these crimes. The bigger crimes, such as high treason, murder, witchcraft, and etc., would lead to the punishment of torture or execution. One thing about execution at the time was it was much more gruesome back then, as can be seen in the pictures.
The people of the Elizabethan era were also known to have many common beliefs for religion, and most importantly, superstition. Just imagine yourself spilling a bit of salt or pepper on the table, no big deal, yeah? And getting yelled at, not for spilling it, but because they believed that would bring bad luck. Same goes for stirring a pot clockwise. Nearly all the Elizabethans believed in the Catholic Church back then. However, as the plague came along, it began to decline. In most cases, people would rather have health treatments that consisted of superstitious beliefs instead of going to a doctor, which seemed pretty ironic because the doctors were supposed to be helpful. However, with their hygiene and treatment, you'd be likely to end up even worse. Now people would be excited to see an eclipse, yeah? While back then, people would consider it as an evil omen. Finally, one of the most believed superstitions was that a woman was considered a witch if she seemed too intelligent or suspicious. They believed that these witches would make an exchange with the devil to receive supernatural powers, allowing them to curse and cast spells to harm others. If anything seemed unnatural, it was blamed on a witch. The witches were also believed to fly on broomsticks, make potions in large cauldrons, and also change their form into an animal, which doesn't make any sense.
Thanks for watching the video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more educational videos just like this one.